Okay, so here's that tutorial in the wild, Tanya Reskia, how to connect with an API in JavaScript. So this video demo, or this demo goes to Studio Ghibli website and it builds this. Ours won't be quite as pretty because we're going to stick with the simpler structural CSS, but it's available here if you want to make that a fancy looking one. But the simpler structural CSS really is going to do us more favors because we're really building toward our Uno API here, and this is going to be kind of a framework for us, at least initially, an initial framework for our application. So I think we're better off with the simple CSS, which we see before us. It does use Flexbox, which we really don't have enough time right now to get into, but is the basis of how Bootstrap containers work. Those are built on Flexboxes, and everything else really in Bootstrap, the way it flows. These are media breakpoints. I think you're probably familiar with that from your CSS tutorials. So let's just run it and see what we have a look at. So I'm going to open with Live Server, which I have here. And we see the icon here, and we'll see all of these elements here, various Studio Ghibli movies that have come from a live API on another computer, the Studio Ghibli API. And think about that for the power of that for a little bit, because there are uncounted numbers of these APIs that are offering free information for your programs, right, for your applications. So this is an example of a REST API call, and this application made those calls. Let's take a look. So the style CSS, relatively simple, as we went over. Let's take a look at the index.html. And we have the head and the body. We use it uses Google Fonts. It includes the style system that we saw before. Everything's flat in this example in the root. And then the body, we just have a single div here with a root ID, and then we include JavaScripts. So this entire application that we see is built in JavaScript with very little HTML at all. So basically what you're going to anticipate seeing is JavaScript that grabs a hold of this ID, as we've done before, but then builds the entire system underneath it. So let's take a look at that. So the scripts start running immediately when the application is loaded. So get element by ID root, we saw that ID here. That's this first div here. And so that's basically a holding place where at the start of the document where everything's going to be included this JavaScript does. So creates an image element, and this is one thing different. Or I did a couple of things different from the tutorial. My logo here is a little bit different from the example given. It looks the same, but I found this actually on Wikipedia, so you can do the same as well. And then notice this didn't start out. It could have, but it didn't start out as HTML. Document create element, a div. Set attribute class container. So this is calling back to the CSS, this container flex wrap, right? So that's the container for this class here. And notice how this JavaScript has set those elements. Document create element div. That's the element we're being created, and we're setting an attribute inside that. Notice that this object is a result of that create element. So then when we address ourselves to container, we're always setting some aspect of the container. Then we take the app itself and append the child. And the app itself was created on the first line one here as the get element by ID root. That's the root div. So we're appending a child, which is the logo, and append the child, which is the container. Now the container is going to get all the action. Now here we run into another modification I've made to the tutorial. This is new XML HTTP request, and that's what's done in the tutorial. And so you can see the request open here is a get verb, and here it hits this. And if you have this URL on a browser, it will show you those results. Let's go ahead. Since it's a get, a browser can do a get, right? But it can't, since the browser is doing a read operation, it can't do a post or a put or anything like that. But it should be able to work here like this. And here we have, look at the JSON that returns from this, and we can see the information here. And I hope you can read this now. This is a JavaScript array, which contains objects. And each one of these objects is about a Studio Ghibli movie. With the title, description. This is a unique ID. It's called a GUID. Here, notice here, people. That's an array. So embedded within this object is an array, just as you can do in JavaScript. Key value pairs here in this JavaScript, or in this JSON object. And that's what we're going to be dealing with. And that's what that's our mine of information. Now, this XML HTTP request is an old way of doing it. Right, so it's a HTTP verb get request. I'm not going to spend too much time on it because I think it's the old way of doing it. Here's another modification that you'll see when you work through the tutorial. I use display data, and we'll look at that last. That's really where the action is. This function has responded. It's responded with a JSON string that we've had here, identically here, right? So this data on line 16 is going to be what we see here. This is the pretty version of it because I have the pretty printer plug-in for the browser. But this JSON is going to be needs to be parsed and turned into a live JavaScript object. And that's what's happened here, JSON.parse, this .response. That's the return. This is an asynchronous function call here, but a little bit older way of doing it than what we've been learning about. So request status is greater than or equal to 200. Basically, it'll work. Otherwise, there's a message here. God, it's not working. We can come back here and mess up this URL, and we'll see that too. Now, I'm actually loading this information twice. So the way the tutorial did it, and then the way we want to focus on going forward, which is using the fetch API, the modern API that uses promises. So remember, when we were going over the syntax for fetch API, it takes two parameters. It takes the API, and then it takes options. So if you're doing a get, you don't need options because everything's in a get. If we think of our experience in Postman, everything in a get can be expressed in the URL. And that's what's happening here. Fetch from this URL, and then our promise. If it works, we'll have a then, which they'll take the data as a JSON data. And then, so remember from promises that we can do promise chaining. So this data.json is actually a parse of that data, what this let's see, JSON.parse is. That's what data.json does here. It takes our the JSON. It's really a text stream or a string that's turned into a live JavaScript object. And because this promise chaining happens, then we have the JSON of that, and then we use display data JSON. And that's why in the tutorial, the author has the display data update happening all here and not in a function. And I wanted to put it in a function so I could use it here and also here. So here, this is really where the action is for us. And I want to look at that in the next video.